This right here is the Sony 18-105 F4 Optical Steady Shot Power Zoom lens, and this right here is what I would recommend for almost anyone who's looking to get one lens to basically work with any sort of work that they do. Yes, it does have a long name, but the name has a lot of the features that comes inside of it. So let's start with F4. Because it's an F4 lens, that means that no matter how far you zoom in, it'll always stay the max aperture of F4. So normally with zoom lenses, the more you zoom in, the more tighter the aperture will be. So for example, the Sony kit lens is 3.5 to 5.6. When you're zoomed wide open, it's 3.5, but it doesn't always stay 3.5. As you zoom in, the aperture starts closing down, but not with this. From 18 all the way up to 105, you can stay constant at F4. Next up, we have 18 to 105. So that means you can go all the way from a super wide open 18 millimeters all the way down to this nice tight 105 millimeters. So that gives you a super wide range of focal lengths, which means that you can basically do any sort of work with this lens. It's also got OSS, which is Sony's Optical Steady Shot, which basically means that the lens is stabilized internally, which means that it basically takes away all the micro jitters that your hand might produce while holding the camera, or maybe when you're pressing down on the shutter button, those little jitters from your finger will be taken away from the image because of this lens. And then finally, which I forgot to mention at the start, it is a G lens, which means you're getting good quality from Sony because they put the G label right on this lens. So overall, it's a great lens. I've been using this since the start of the summer, and I still use it all the time, and I don't really see myself switching from this lens for quite some time now. So let's go in a little bit deeper into this lens. So since it has such a wide focal length range, it really means that you can do pretty much anything you normally do photography or videography with. You can go from landscapes and architecture with the super wide open 18 millimeters to portraits, all the way to the mid-range of the zoom amount. And then all the way up to 105, you can start doing some wildlife photography or even shooting weddings or events where you can stay back in the shadows and not have to worry about being right in the action. You can kind of take a step back and still be able to get a tight shot because of the super far distance that you can shoot from. The lens feels like it's built well. It's a little on the heavy side, but it's not too heavy to make it uncomfortable. Considering you're getting a lens that goes from 18 all the way up to 105, it is a fairly small lens, especially when you consider the size of other lenses with similar focal lengths. This is a Sony lens, which is a full frame 28 to 135 f4. So it's basically the exact same focal length and aperture as this lens, but it's quite a bit bigger and almost maybe 3 times the weight. So considering you're getting the same output from both lenses, maybe a little bit less quality on this because of this is like $4,000. You're getting quite a lot packed into this tiny little lens, which is much less heavy than this big guy. It's pretty much all metal on the outside, which makes it feel like it's sturdy. It can take a pretty decent beating. The focus and zoom rings are also made of metal, so it's grippy and you don't really have to worry too much about slipping. It's not weather sealed, so I'm always cautious to take this out into the rain or snow, but I think throw a bag over top and you can still shoot without having to worry. And then on the tip, you've got some plastic screw-on rings for your filters, and then all your glass inside, which has a bunch of coatings that I don't really know too much about, but it seems to block out a lot of bad flares and doesn't really produce any sort of bad, weird color effects that some cheaper lenses might produce. Speaking of filters, it's got a 72 millimeter diameter, which means that it's a little on the bigger side, but thankfully if you got a 77 millimeter, which I think is a little bit more popular, you can always throw a step-up ring onto this lens and just pop your filter back onto this. Now, one thing that this lens has that most lenses don't have is this little rocker for zoom. So it's a powered zoom lens, which means that you can use it almost like an old style camcorder where you can power your zoom all the way back and forward, and it's a constant zoom which you can change the speed from inside of your camera. There's many different ways that you can use this in creative styles. You can go for a cheesy look by doing a slow zoom in, making it look like a camcorder. You can also replicate some of the old VHS looks by using this zoom, but you can also use this to make some interesting dolly zoom effects, for example. So there's a lot that you can do with a power zoom lens that you can't with normal lenses. Another thing about this lens is that it's also based on a flywheel system, which means that your manual focus and your manual zoom are going to be a little bit smoother, but it's going to give you a little bit of a different look and feel than normal lenses will. Because it's not a linear effect of your zoom or focus as you're changing the ring, the flywheel will kind of dampen it on both ends, which means that you'll always get a little bit of a different look than if you were to do a normal zoom or focus on a different lens. So again, something that might not be for everyone, but it's also another thing that can be used a little bit more creatively with this lens because it is available on this lens. So with your zoom, since you have 18 to 105, it really opens up a lot of possibilities of ways that you can use it, especially if you have a newer Sony camera like my a6500, which has clear image zoom. That basically lets you take your image and inside of the camera it punches in an extra 2 times, which means that you get 2 times the crop, which basically lets this lens turn into a 18 to 210 millimeter, which is crazy for the size of this lens. Now there are some restrictions with clear image zoom. You can use it in video and in 4K because this a6500 downsamples from 6K to 4K, but I don't think you can shoot in RAW while using clear image zoom. I think you might have to shoot in JPEG to do that. I'm not positive because I don't usually use it, but I think I might start trying it out with this lens just to try and see what kind of 210 millimeter shots that I can get with it. And then one final note about zoom is that all of the zooming is done within this lens. So when you're at 18 millimeters or 105 millimeters, this lens stays exactly this length. Normally with other longer but cheaper lenses, the lens will extend further as you zoom in and then contract when you zoom out. This creates an issue when you're using a gimbal because the extra length will start making your balance unstable. So keeping all of the zooming within one size really helps stabilize your camera on the gimbal no matter how far you're zoomed in. Another really cool thing you can do with this is, now this might seem like a very specific use case to people who only have this certain setup, but if you have this lens and a Sony A6000 series camera and a Ronin S with the focus wheel and a cable that connects to the camera, you can use the focus wheel on the Ronin to control the zoom from the handle of the Ronin while your camera is up on top being stabilized. So that means that you can zoom in while you're walking around all the way from 18 to 105 without even having to reach up and touch the lens, which means that you can walk around while zooming, getting some interesting shots, like a completely dynamic dolly zoom effect without having to worry about touching the lens and messing up the stabilization of the gimbal. Other gimbals might work with this as well, but I've only tested this on my Ronin S, so feel free to test this out and let me know if this works for you as well if you have this lens or any other power zoom lens. I've also tested this out on the kit lens, so if you don't have this lens but you have everything else, feel free to try that out because it does make for some better event shooting from my experience. Speaking of the kit lens, if you do only have the kit lens, this is one lens that I would highly suggest making your first purchase of a lens, because normally a lot of people will go out and buy a 18 millimeter or a 50 millimeter or an 85 millimeter, and they'll get all these lenses, but then they're going to be stuck to only being able to use one at a time. And if you're looking for your first lens to buy, this is one that I would highly suggest for anyone because it's such a wide range. And this really goes for beginners because they may not know what kind of genre of videography or photography they want to work in. This super wide range gives them the flexibility to do whatever they want. Obviously not anything up to like 400 millimeters, but it's quite a decent range that they can work within, giving them a lot of opportunities to do many different things. Now next, in terms of focus, this lens has really great autofocus. I don't think I've ever missed a shot, or at least 99% of my shots I've taken with this lens have been dead on proper focus. But the lens is a little bit on the less sharper side. So while it does catch the focus correctly, the lens is known to be a little bit more on the softer end of the sharpness scale. But this is also typical for most zoom lenses because I guess it's hard for all the little elements in the lens to properly focus on everything from the entire range. And I guess that's why prime lenses, which are just a single focal length, can perform better in terms of sharpness. But that doesn't mean that you'll be losing focus. It just means that your properly focused parts of your image may not be as sharp. But this can always be fixed in post if you're not satisfied with it. But personally, it hasn't been too much of an issue for me because most of my images I just throw onto Instagram anyways. But if you're not much of an autofocus person, there is also manual focus on this lens, obviously, because what lens doesn't have manual focus? And the manual focus is okay. It's definitely something you'll have to get used to with the flywheel system, but once you're fine with it, then I don't really think there's much of an issue. The Sony cameras have really nice focus peaking, which can help out find your focus while you're using manual focus. So honestly, I think whenever you have an issue with manual focus, it really comes down to the user, but I really haven't had much of an issue with manual focus on this lens either. Next up, we've got the Aperture, which is the famous F4 on this lens. Now, when I was a little less experienced with looking into lenses, when I saw constant F4, I thought that meant that you couldn't stop down from F4. So if you were wanting to do a long exposure, you couldn't go down to like an F16. But that's not the case. It's not saying that. You can go all the way down if you want to, but constant F4 just means that when you're zooming in, it's not going to be changing between apertures. So the constant in this case is just talking about in terms of the various zoom levels. So it still has the normal iris range from maximum of 4 all the way down to something like f22. So you don't have to worry about that like I did. It's just like a normal lens, but it has that constant f4 throughout the zoom range. I think my least favorite part of this lens though is the fact that it's only f4. After using lenses that are, you know, f2.8 or f1.8, f4 is really tough to work in, especially in low light, because you always basically have to be boosting your ISO or your shutter speed, which isn't always possible when you're working with video. And boosting your ISO isn't always the nicest thing to do because of all the grain that can be produced. So I think my biggest gripe with this lens is the fact that it's only f4, but that really only pertains to nighttime or low light situations. So if you're finding that you're shooting mostly in the daytime and not much in low light, then this is a good lens for you. If you find that you shoot a lot in low light, like weddings or other events, or nighttime or street photography at night, you can work with this lens. You have to be a little bit more intentional on the different light sources that you're capturing and maybe the different lights that you're carrying with you. So it's definitely still possible to use this lens in lower light situations. You just have to think a little bit more about your situation. And then finally, the last few features would be the Optical Steady Shot, which is the internal stabilization where somehow within this lens all of the optics are stabilized, which makes your shots steadier. This lens paired with an A65 or A6600 and a gimbal makes for the absolute smoothest footage that you can ever get handheld, that I can think of at least, because you have really good internal lens stabilization, which helps with micro jitters. You have internal sensor stabilization, which helps for a little bit bigger shakes like steps. And then putting all of this onto a gimbal helps for getting the super smooth footage that you need to capture. But even for photography, having this lens is helpful because, especially as a street photographer, the worst thing that can ever happen when you're taking a shot is that little micro jitter happens when you're taking the shot, and then the shot's out of focus, the moment's ruined, and you don't have the photo that you wanted to capture. So having the optical steady shot in the lens is also an extra little bonus. Another way that the OSS, or optical, not obstacle, steady shot can help is if you're vlogging. I've got a GorillaPod here, so if I was to throw this into vlogging mode, you can tell that the lens isn't too heavy for the 3K GorillaPod. Even if I'm kind of shaking it around, the GorillaPod's not really bending at all, so that means that the lens, as big as it looks, it's not too heavy, which means that it's great for traveling around. But since you have the OSS in the lens here, you can vlog comfortably because of the 18mm and not have to worry about little jitters that your hand may be producing when you're holding like a GorillaPod or another handle like this. So even though I'm not much of a vlogger, I can because of this lens and the OSS inside of it. I don't really have to worry about that shaking that some lenses may produce. So with all that said, you might be thinking that this lens is a crazy amount of money, considering that most of the features in this lens are also in this lens, and this big lens here is about $4,000, so this must be somewhere close by. But this lens is actually on sale on Amazon right now for 650 Canadian, which is somewhere in the 500 to 550 range in American, I think. So you're definitely getting quite a significant bang for your buck with this lens. It doesn't come with many accessories. Basically what you can see here is what you get. You get the lens, you get the lens hood, and you get a lens cap and the little lens cover for the bottom. That's basically all that comes in the box. They really kept it really simple for quite a nice price. So with all that being said, that's it for this video. I'm going to link it down in the description if you want to go check it out and support the channel if you end up buying it. Feel free to throw any questions in the comments if you have any more questions about this lens. So I guess that's it for me today. I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.